Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to begin with a quote from Tennyson's Morte d'Arthur. The old ordered and slowly answered Arthur from the barge. The old order changeth, yielding place to new. And God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. The old order changeth. I remember talking to Leonard Woolf, spending one afternoon with him down at Rodmell, and his saying that the first 50 years of the last century, he had lived through so many dramatic changes, the vast improvements in education, in housing, in medicine. But we, at the turn of the century, have seen different changes. We have seen the fragmentation of so much of society and of traditions that we have grown up with and lived with. And to many people, this is threatening and alarming. We see, as an article in the Tablet last week recorded, the rapid decline of attendances both in Roman Catholic and Anglican churches. We see fewer and fewer people going to theatres. We also see, as the director of the Birmingham Conservatoire of Music told me only 2 weeks ago, declining audiences in the concert hall and certain orchestras being closed down. There's a great deal of change taking place, and on a sacred level, many would agree with Lawrence van der Prost, who wrote, "Fewer and fewer of us can find religious awareness anymore in churches and temples or in the religious establishments of our time. Much as we long for the churches to renew themselves and once more become, in contemporary idiom, an instrument of the Pentecostal spirit, many of us now have to testify that despite the examples of dedicated men and women devoted to their theological vocations, they have failed to give modern man a living experience of religion, such as I and others have found in the desert and among the Bushmen of Africa." And when it comes to ritual, we see an extraordinary fragmentation in our society. We no longer have rituals that relate to the initiation of young men or young women. And as Robert Bly has said repeatedly, this is a matter of great urgency in our society. It's no wonder we have so much vandalism and juvenile crime, because we have no initiation ceremony. In the rites of passage in former societies, mummy's boy would at a certain moment be taken away by the male members of the community and put through a series of initiation tests, and after weeks and sometimes months, would now return to the community no longer as mummy's boy, but as a man among the males of the community. We no longer have rituals for mothers learning to let go of their children. I remember one of my PhD students in America who was ordained as a Zoroastrian priest. He was an Indian, ordained at the age of 8. He told me how their family priest used to regularly, this is a custom that you will find still in India, would regularly visit his mother and say to her, "Give me the thing that is most precious to you." And so she might give him a necklace. And the next time he would say, "Give me that which is most precious to you." And she would give him her earrings. And she knew what was coming, that one day he came and said, "Give me your son." And she knew that she would have to hand him over. We have no rituals for young girls the moment that they become women. They go through their first menstruation, but there's no ritual to help them in the way that in the Jewish faith, the Orthodox Jewish faith, you have a bar mitzvah for the young male for his entry into puberty, but nothing for the girl. When it comes to marriage, increasingly in our society, people who are not Christians or have no particular religious affiliation are bewildered as to they're faced either with the registry office or, as they're now beginning to experiment with, is there a way of creating their own ritual of marriage? And within marriage and within human relationships, we have no rituals for such painful life experiences as, for instance, a woman who suffers a miscarriage, which is an extremely traumatic and painful experience. We have no rituals for the parents of a child who is stillborn. The NHS for a few years, but now no longer, did employ one midwife in the whole of England, Elizabeth Hamby, whose task it was to help parents who had a stillborn baby to deal with this loss and to evolve a ritual for the funeral of the child. And the baby would be dressed in beautiful clothes and placed in a cradle. Photographs would be taken of it, prints made of the baby's feet and the baby's hands. So it was a real living child and held by the father, by the mother, and if there were little brothers and sisters, they would also hold the dead child. And then they would discuss what form the family wanted the funeral to take place. We have no rituals to deal with the breakup of a marriage or a relationship. People break apart in great pain and sometimes in great anger and bitterness. And the churches certainly don't want to hear. The churches should have rituals to deal with the dissolution of a marriage. The Order of Franciscan Friars and the Anglican Church has a ritual when a friar decides he's not going to take the final vows. There is a simple ritual held to release that friar from the vows that he has already taken up to this point. We have no rituals that deal with retirement. I was describing to the group today a friend of mine who, when he retired from being an architect and found it very painful entering an unknown future, he was helped by a small group of friends to enter into a ritual of retirement, which was a healing process for him. We have no rituals following on from that for the elders of our society. We wait for people to die, and then we spend a lot of money sending bouquets of flowers, which are of no value to them whatsoever. And I remember once when I was newly ordained, I have to say I'm an unpaid, non-stipendiary, so I don't really... Anyway, that's another problem, another story, another problem. Problem is a key word, probably. We had a woman who was coming up to be 70 in our tiny village in Wales, and she was a gynecologist, and she'd given birth to many now grown-up people in the whole area. She was also a deaconess. She had done great service for the community, and the local farmer's wife felt that there should be a service held to honour Margaret. And I discussed this with our vicar. He said, no way, absolutely no. And I said, why not? He said, because if you do it for one, you'll have to do it for all the others. And in the end, we did have the service because the farmer's wife rebelled. And she said, well, we'll have it in the farmhouse then, blow the vicar. So we had it in the church. There were two bishops spoke about her life's work. She'd already entered into Alzheimer's, but was sufficiently aware to know what was happening and to be deeply moved by what was being said, by flowers that children whom she delivered into the world came forward to present to her. Rituals to honour the elders of our society. And when it comes to the last event in our lives, death, increasingly people are awash, not knowing what to do. They don't want a funeral service in a church. What are they to do with the body of the beloved one who has just died? So we see all this fragmentation going on, and what is to happen. But first, before I try and answer that question for you, perhaps we should look at the nature of ritual. And ritual actually covers so many aspects of our lives, which in ways that perhaps you're not even aware of. And I think the best way of learning about ritual is to observe the behavior of small children. For instance, the good night ritual of telling a story to the child, and the importance that a small child places upon the repetition of the same words, the same phrases in a beloved story. Also, why is this? Why does the child need that good night ritual? For a small child, the night and the dark is a very frightening voyage to take. And there's always the hidden fear that when I wake up in the morning, mummy or daddy may not be there. And that does happen in reality. My friend Sean Dunn, the Irish poet, in Cork 2 years ago, only age 38, went night time, kissed his 2 boys good night, went to bed, and when his wife woke up in the morning, he was lying dead beside her. So for those 2 small boys, that was the last kiss from their father, and it's very important that he did give it to them. Children also need the ritual of being seen off to school, because going off to school to the jungle of the outside world is very daunting, and often there's a lot of injustice from teachers or cruelty from their peers in the playground. And so they put on an armour of a school uniform and a cap and a satchel. And the important thing is the hug, the embrace, the kiss as they're sent off out into the world. And then comes later in the day a ritual that our society sees less and less, and I think it has dangerous consequences, is that when the child comes home from school in the afternoon, he sheds his armour, changes into his ordinary clothes, but most important, he's come back into the safe harbour of home, but he needs, or she needs, to be welcomed, to be listened to hear what's happened during the day. That's very important, that ritual of coming home from school. And so we begin to see the importance for children of ritual, that it creates a sense of order, a sense of safety. And if you think about each of us getting up in the morning, everybody has their own personal, you may call them habits, rituals of how you get out of bed, how you get washed, how you get shaved, how you come to terms with the world. I have one friend who scrubs the floor every morning. It's a kind of ritual cleansing in order to come to terms with going out into the world, to work out in the world. And it's all about, our whole day is structured in this way. Our whole life is structured in this way, because if we didn't have a structure, if we didn't have a series of rituals, we would be overwhelmed by chaos. In fact, if you interfere with somebody's personal rituals in the morning or hurry them, they become very disordered and disorientated, and it can be quite harmful to them. So we see that rituals work at a very simple, basic level to create, remember the American poet Robert Frost saying once of his poems, he said, "Each poem that I write is one more stay against confusion." And what he meant was that each time you paint a picture or write a poem or create a ritual or sing a song, you are creating some kind of order in this very bewildering universe in which we live. And our own emotions are bewildering and chaotic. So we need to create some kind of order out of disorder. But today, as the theatre director Peter Brook has said, we have lost all sense of ritual and ceremony. But the words remain with us, and the old impulses stir in the marrow. We do not know how to celebrate because we do not know what to celebrate. And thinking of how the old words remain with us, I was telling the others this afternoon of an experience in 1970 in our little church in Wales. I was just an ordinary layman, and only 4 people ever worshipped in the church on Sundays, and on Christmas Day 6 people would come to the church. And I suggested to the then rector that we should have a service on Christmas Eve, because I said Christmas Eve is a threshold time, and a lot of people are very lonely. Older people, their children have grown up and left home, or there's a lot of pain and bitterness in the family, and that's the time when you need the service. He, again, another clergyman, saying no, absolutely no, he would not do this. And I had a fierce argument with him, and he said finally in anger, all right, well, if you will organize the whole thing, I'll come in and do a blessing at the end. So we organized a service, or I did, and it was packed to his chagrin and embarrassment. Chapel people came who had never been to the church before. It was jammed to the doors. And we create a simple ritual which goes on to this day, though I'm no longer involved with it, in that the people were gathered inside the church, first of all in the dark, thinking about that line in the Old Testament, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And then from the village green, there was heard a loud banging of cymbals and saucepans and drums, and approaching the church, the village children singing raucously, Gloria in excelsis Deo, bang, 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 thump, 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 until they came to the church door, and it was a loud banging at the church door. And someone inside called out, "Who is it?" And a small boy answered, "It is the Christ child." And the person inside said, "Let him enter." And so the doors opened, and a procession of children came in 2 by 2, carrying baskets of mince pies, and the last 2 carrying an image of a newborn male baby, and they were all singing Adeste Fidelis, and some of them were carrying baskets of candles. And for this occasion, all the chairs had been arranged in 3 circles around a manger. And so the baby was placed in the manger, and the candles were all lit. So there were 3 circles of candles, and then a series of readings and carols. And then, what had never been done in that church before, hot mince pies and coffee was served, and everybody stayed for nearly 2 hours talking and sharing and communing with one another. And that is an example of how you can respond. The old words are still there in the marrow of our bones, but they need reviving. What people are still in search of, there's a tremendous, we know this from statistics, a tremendous hunger for the things of the Spirit. There's a great spiritual search going on in the country. And what the new cardinal at Westminster is aware of is that the churches must be aware of this search and respond to it. So the wonderful thing about Quakers, the Quaker faith, is to be where a person stands, to stand under that person, not to preach at them. There's a great need for the sense of the sacred, as exampled in this letter that I received from a woman then in her 70s, describing something that happened some years ago up on the hills of Malvern. This is her writing. "We once, many years ago, when our girls were still young, went up Midsummer Hill on the Malverns to see the sun rise. We started off from our cottage at 3 o'clock in the morning and climbed silently while still dark on a warm and lovely morning. The dawn chorus was just starting and the air throbbed with birdsong. At the summit were small groups of people, some young students still sleeping in their sleeping bags, some softly drumming on guitars. There was no traffic, no discordant sounds, just a soft humming of voices to muted chords, and a great feeling of friendship. We were all drawn together, waiting for the perfect moment when the first sliver of red sun appeared. One held one's breath, one prayed. The guitars stopped, the voices stopped. It was the end of the world, so silent, and the beginning. For with the rising of that glorious sun and the streaking of the dark sky with red and gold, a great sigh of joy and wonder spread amongst those who were there. And as the full light of day transfixed that hilltop, faces flushed with delight, some with tears of joy, and a sharing of such a deep spiritual companionship that forever has stayed with us all. For a brief while, we were cleansed of all inhibitions, fears, and barriers. It was a worship and a celebration. God was there and touched us all. Silently, we were all reborn. What an experience. Later, a happy crowd of us surged into the little wooden hut on top of the hill for breakfast, served especially on this morning. We all talked. The fragrance of hot coffee, sizzling bacon had drifted across the hills. It was cold, and never did a meal taste so good. That sense of the sacred is what people are in search of. So what is fundamentally missing? I'd like to take a quote here from Joanna Trollope, from her novel, which some of you have probably read, The Rector's Wife. She says, people lack the capacity to live life richly at any level. People lack the capacity to live life richly at any level. And yet there is today in people a very real hunger, as I've said, for the things of the Spirit. So what has been lost? in the shelves upstairs, I've come across the latest book by James Hillman. And in the beginning, he answers this question, which he tries to address in this book called The Soul's Code. What is lost and must be recovered is the sense of personal calling, that there is a reason I am alive, that there is a reason for my unique person being here, and that there are things I must attend to beyond the daily round, and that give the daily round its reason, feelings that the world somehow wants me here, that I am answerable to an innate image which I am filling out in my biography. And what is needed is to stimulate people's imaginations. This is why all the great teachers, Buddha, Jesus, you can name all the great teachers, taught in parables, in stories, in order to stimulate our imaginations, which are sluggish. Because what the imagination does, it enables us to see beyond the immediate, both in science, in religion, and in metaphysics. And John Keats once wrote, I think in that famous letter from Teignmouth, in fact, I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. And images are no more than means by which we can chart our individual journeys. They're not resting places, but they're pointers to the truth within ourselves. And many, many people feel that they're not fully living. Time and time again, in workshops that I do, workshops that other people do, you hear these kind of comments. I feel I'm not creative, not expressing myself. I want to learn how to be expressive through my body, to be less cerebral. I want to get in touch with my real self. Or as another person said, I have a personal need to find meaningful and healing rituals. Because what has happened in so many of the existing rituals in churches and temples and synagogues is they have become fossilized by repetition. There's no living fire within them, no real sense of being touched by the Spirit. And to give you an example of how the imagination can bring a person fully alive, is the story of a woman who once heard me speak on television, and she wrote to me. She was in her 60s, and what she wrote in her first letter, she referred to the fact that she had only 6 months left to live. In fact, she lived a great deal longer. She said, I need spiritual and mental help. Till I heard you, I was resigned to sitting it out to the end. And her early letters were full of anger towards God, towards the church, towards the world. And in the course of our correspondence, I learned that at the age of 18, she had studied art. And then she gave it all up because, in her own words, she said she was afraid to allow herself to be spontaneous because, quote, spontaneity is lovely, but there is a risk. And so rather than take this risk, she repressed her true self. She repressed her rich creativity and, to quote her own words, flung myself into secretarial work, changed jobs frequently, and have ended up with only a state pension. I am left with an ability to feel beauty in all its forms, but no ability now to pick up pencil or brush. Too diminished and mentally exhausted to do, I am left with a sense of having wasted my life. I wrote back to her suggesting that she buy herself a child's box of paints and that each day she paint a picture for me, rather like a child, not trying to censor it or question it, and to put the date on each one. And a few weeks later, there arrived a painting from her and a letter. The painting was of a bowl of flowers, and the flowers were exploding with joyous colours, and the shape of the vase was echoed underneath like a shadow, and it looked like two great swinging bells. You could see the clappers ringing there. The picture radiated such a sense of release, of spontaneity, of joy. And with it came this letter in which she wrote, "You have reached me, the real me, the soft, vulnerable me, the one that wants to climb out and flow to be a kind and lovable person instead of tautened up, spitting aggression. I was so happy, in capital letters. The transformation through using one's own creativity and finding out something of the person that one really is. And so it's creativity that leads one into ritual, because ritual is an enactment of our most important and deepest feelings. I'll give you one small example. My mother didn't really understand my nature, but I owe everything to her. But she couldn't dialogue with me except on very simple matters. But whenever I was staying with her, every day she would place on my desk an egg cup filled with tiny flowers picked from the hedgerow. And this simple ritual of the egg cup filled with flowers touched me very deeply and continues to move me, even though she's been dead many years, because through it she was expressing her love for me, her watchfulness over me. In fact, very interestingly, when she died, about 2 or 3 weeks after her death, I haven't said this before, I was crossing Piccadilly Circus, and I looked up in the sky, and it was as though a slide had been slid across the day, and I saw my mother laughing and very young, and I knew then that she understood totally and was keeping watch over me, as she had tried to do in her life. So ritual is an enactment of our deepest feelings. A simple ritual, like the egg cup full of flowers, is an offering of oneself, a gift of oneself, to a deity, to a cause, or to another human being. It is a giving of oneself. So in what ways can one create simple rituals in one's daily life in order to nurture one's inner being? We looked at some of these today. For instance, it's very important in every house to have one's own sacred space. If you go into any household in India, however crowded with children and grandparents, one corner there will be a little curtain drawn across. Behind it there are icons and votive lamps, and any member of the household can go behind that curtain and be alone to meditate or just to be. And it's very important to have some area in the house where one knows that one can go apart and be with one's gods. In what other ways can one celebrate? The key word is celebrate. We need to rediscover the joy and the art and the ritual of celebration. When friends come to visit me for a meal in Wales, the great joy is first of all in the preparation of the food, because it is a gift to them. So the way I prepare the food, the way the table is laid, and then the moment that they step over the threshold of one's home and one holds them in an embrace. This is a gift to people. It is a simple ritual, the sharing of food, but a very powerful one. It's very interesting in that description of Midsummer Morn on the Malvern Hills, how everybody ended up having strong mugs of tea and bacon sandwiches. The sharing of food is very, very powerful indeed. Also, the importance of ritualizing one's expressions of gratitude. It's really a question of honoring people and valuing people for themselves. Again, I was saying this afternoon that when somebody's name comes into my head, maybe I haven't been in communication with them for a long time, I take that as a signal to telephone them or to write to them or to send them a gift of some kind, because we are all much closer to each other than we realize, and we ought to trust these telepathic messages that come to us. So often it happens, people say, oh, I was just thinking of you, or I wanted to hear from you. We need to give people gifts, not just on birthdays, but to honor them in different ways, and to honor also our gratitude to life. Again, this afternoon, I was saying just nearly 2 years ago, I had cancer and had to face the possibility of dying. And I recovered, and my partner, quite spontaneously in the garden, built an edifice of marvelous stones from the hills, and then poised above it a marble owl with outstretched wings and some plants in the middle. And a friend of mine, Diana Walker, who came, who's a healer, she said, it's quite clear that is his expression of gratitude for James's recovery from cancer. Giving expression, the planting of trees or bushes in one's garden in memory of a friend who has died. Now, I'd like to give you some examples of new rituals that have been created for certain life situations. Here is a ritual that was created by a priest friend of mine. It's not a baptism because the parents are Buddhists, but they wanted a ritual welcome for their little girl called Esther. And this is what happened in the village of Bleddwer 2 years ago. A ritual of welcome for Esther. We gathered at Springfield at Bleddwer on a beautiful May morning. The group of 12 then walked together into the dingle to a small grassy platform on the edge of the brook, which flows rapidly through. The trees in the dingle, and these were farming people. It's very important to stress that. These are not sophisticated middle-class people. These are country people. The trees in the dingle were hung with multicolored Tibetan prayer flags, and a small bowl of water, a silver spoon, and some hand symbols lay on the grass. John, who is the priest, drew the group into a circle, rang the cymbals, and then led the group in a listening meditation on the natural sounds of the running water, the bird song, the sheep, and the lambs. The cymbals again being rung, Esther's grandparents, the young Mel and Steve, spoke a welcome, which they had composed themselves. This was followed by another stillness, broken by the cymbals, after which Beth, Esther's mother, spoke of her gratitude for Esther. Michael's mother, that's the husband, Anne, spoke of her delight in her granddaughter. And then John, the priest, led the group in the direction of our heart's love to Esther's heart, Esther, the baby, lying with absolute stillness in her mother's arms. Taking the bowl of water and the spoon from the grass, John poured the water 3 times over Esther's head and kissed her. Then each member of the group made the same action, pouring water and kissing. After a stillness, John spoke an extempore prayer for Esther's blood family, including Albert, the grandfather, his mother, who is in residential care. Jean, the maternal grandmother, read the blessing of solitude from the Celtic book Anam Cara, a present from James to Michael. And Michael, who's the Buddhist, read very slowly and phrase by phrase Psalm 23. All then held hands in the circle, and all the words having been spoken reflected in silence on the ritual. Blankets were then spread on the grass, champagne was fetched from where it had been cooling in the stream, toasts were made, and all were gently together in easy friendship. And the grandfather, Albert, who's a great friend of mine, he's only in his 50s, he's a farm labourer. He was so moved and proud of this simple ceremony of the welcoming and naming of his first and only granddaughter. People are also experimenting with marriages, and I was once approached, Sarah said to me one day, "Will you marry me?" And I was taken aback for a moment, and then I realized what she was saying. She and Steve had been living together for a number of years and decided now they wanted to have a ritual which would honor their marriage. They were going to have a registry ceremony, the legal ceremony, but they wanted a ritual. And so I asked them, first of all, we had many meetings before we evolved what happened, but I asked them both to write to me individually without consulting the other as to why they felt the need of a marriage ritual. And this is what Sarah wrote. She said, "Marriage to Steve symbolizes to me a bringing together, although not a merging, of many opposites, of togetherness and separateness, of gain and loss, of pleasure and sadness, a further step towards individuation, perhaps. Jung said that you cannot change living as a hermit on a mountaintop. Needing others is part of constellating parts of yourself within the other before accepting them as your own." She then talks about that the ceremony will also provide a base for a new family, a home for her as mother and Steve as the father. She was not yet pregnant. And she said this represents, this is a true rite of passage, what she's talking about. This marriage represents a tremendous step of transition for me, both into these middle years, I am 35 this year, and away finally from the tight bonds with my father and to a lesser extent my mother. It is one paradox amongst many that it has only been through my engagement to Steve that I felt finally able to be clear in my mind that I will never, in my fantasy mind, that I will never marry my father, and just how damaging that would be for me, especially my female self. I know marriage to be a very unreliable container, yet through its possibilities I have felt liberated from something quite incestuous in its intimacy. Perhaps feeling able to go from daughter to lover to wife and perhaps mother constellates my struggle to allow my female self to be and to emerge. For as long as I can remember, this self has been derided and downgraded by myself and not allowed life. Steve has allowed a slow opening of the door to this side of me. Steve's own passage through son to lover, to husband, and perhaps to father have also worked their own way through the relationship. Marriage is our rite of passage, our coming together and our celebration of how much we love one another, despite all our difficulties and frustrations. It involves for me, as we move towards it, both loss and sadness, as well as great joy and fulfillment. It is a symbol of our transition, a marker we put down at this time and at this place, an outward manifestation of our inner worlds together and apart. And so we began to plan the ceremony. And because she had been brought up in a Quaker atmosphere, but no longer was a Quaker, she wanted it to happen in the Quaker meeting house in Hampstead. And first of all, it was a square room. The walls were decorated with the wonderful garlands of dark green with white roses and white jasmine and white carnations all round the room. Then there was a circle of chairs, and Sarah bought this amazing midnight blue silk studded with golden stars, and she had that draped over the circle of chairs. And in the center of the circle was a circular table on which there was a goblet of wine, a plate of bread, and a bowl of salt. And as people arrived, and they were just her very close friends and intimates, and amazingly her analyst came. Later there was an enormous party for the outer circle of friends, but she just wanted the intimates with whom to share this important commitment that they were going to make to each other. And as people entered, they were handled candles in small blue glass holders, so that as people sat in the circle, there was also a circle of fire which Sarah and Steve and I entered. And I was told quite firmly that God was not allowed to be mentioned in the ceremony. So God was not mentioned. And the center of it was an image from a letter of Keats, who talks about the wine of love and the bread of friendship. So the cup was lifted and the wine drunk by Steve and Sarah and then passed round the circle and everybody drank. Then the bread was broken and eaten by Sarah and Steve and passed round the circle and eaten. And then the bowl of salt symbolized the fact that in committing yourself to marriage, you will have to accept that there will be pain and disappointments and difficulties. And so they tasted the salt, and everybody tasted the salt. And then there were some simple prayers, and at the end, Sarah asked, although nobody there was a Quaker, if we could have 50 minutes of Quaker silence. So I explained to people what this is about, and if they felt moved to speak, they could. And that was indeed very powerful, because about 4 people, young people, spoke about Sarah and Steve and what they were doing. And this marriage ritual made such a powerful impact upon those present, and it had the authority that it had come from the 2 of them together. It was their ceremony. One other example, this is really, in a way, rediscovering ancient rituals. That's another thing that we can do, is to rediscover the great liturgies and the great rituals which seem to have died but can be new life breathed into them. I was asked in London to baptize a little girl of 2, Georgiana, whose father is Scottish but whose mother was a Thai and a Buddhist. And when the little girl was born, she was given a Thai welcome, because the mother was a very devout Buddhist. The mother was now dying of cancer. She died, in fact, 12 days after this baptism. She came to the ceremony beautifully dressed, but totally yellow all over, and everybody knew that she was dying. And I realized that my task was to honor the Buddhist tradition and the Christian tradition. I also realized that one didn't want standing around the font type of baptism. So I created an encampment of chairs, so that there were a lot of Thai people there as well as English people. And the parents sat on one side on the bench with the little girl, and what I call the guardians rather than godparents on this side. And at the beginning, it was in the autumn, so I had gathered autumn leaves off the hill. And a small boy whom I'd baptized many years ago handed round to everybody present an autumn leaf. And they were all holding these leaves. And I then explained why they had been given a leaf. There's a story of the Buddha at the end of his life that he was walking in the fields with his disciples, and all these leaves on the ground, and he picked one up and he said, "Look at this leaf. This represents what I have been able to teach you, but look at all the other leaves on the ground." And I then linked this with the end of St. John's Gospel, where St. John says there are not enough books in the whole world to put down all the things that Jesus said. And I said that we were here on this day to honor these two great spiritual traditions, the Buddhist tradition and the Christian tradition. And if some of the people present thought this strange, I then told them of how my great friend Dame Felicitas Corrigan of Stambrook Abbey, now in her 80s, a very formidable and powerful scholar and a great nun, told me how for a period of 6 weeks at Stambrook Abbey, 2 Buddhist monks lived inside the enclosure. No male is ever allowed inside the enclosure, but these 2 Buddhist monks were. One was the second in command to the Dalai Lama, and they shared all the meals with the nuns in their refectory. They took part in all the offices in the Abbey church. And when I asked Dame Felicitas how this was possible, she said, "The Holy Father has asked that there be greater dialogue between Buddhists and Catholics." And so we began the ceremony, and so the ceremony honored these 2 traditions. And I just give an example of how the ceremony was adjusted. The guardians, not godparents, had to make a pledge, and these were the words: the child was parted from the mother and handed over to the guardians, who held her and promised that they would always stand by her in friendship. And this is what they pledged aloud: "We pledge ourselves under the eye of heaven to watch over this child, to support and encourage her according to our gifts, whenever she shall need us on her journey. In the name of the Buddha of compassion, and in the name of Christ, Amen." And then after the baptism, and again the thing about clergy need to be much more flexible and in the present moment, it was quite clear that the little girl was very nervous about the baptism. So though I was wearing a long white robe, I slid down onto my knees. And this encouraged the parents, then slid down on their knees, and the guardians. We all sat on the floor for the baptism. It was wonderfully homely. And then the mother gave to her own daughter an ancient Celtic blessing, which you may not have come across. This is what the Thai Buddhist mother said to her child: "Be the great God between thy shoulders, Georgiana. Be the eternal mother near thy heart, Georgiana. And be the perfect spirit upon thee pouring, Georgiana." And then all together we said the prayer: "O Lord, be thou a bright flame before Georgiana, be thou a guiding star above her, be thou a smooth path below her, today, tonight, and forever." And so in that ceremony of the baptism of Georgiana, one was honouring two great spiritual traditions. Many people now are experimenting with funerals. And one of the most moving ones I heard of, again, which was taking a traditional form of an Anglican funeral, was down in Sussex. There was an old lady who had died, much loved in the community, and the composer John Taverner played the organ for the occasion. But what was fascinating is one entered the porch, there were all these coloured balloons in the porch. And as the coffin came out to the little cemetery, and there were a lot of children there as well, everybody took a balloon, and they all stood round the grave, and one by one they spoke some memory of this little old lady, and when they finished speaking, they let the balloons. And so over the Sussex Downs, you saw all these balloons drifting away. A wonderful image of learning to let go. When I take a funeral, I've added a new thing, and I once had an argument with the undertaker about it. He said, well, it's never been done in my time, he said, and I said, no, because I've invented it. I always ask for a little tiny wreath of country flowers to be placed on the end of the coffin with a thick candle lit, so that when the coffin is carried in, there's this living flame, being a symbol, if you like, of the living presence of the spirit of that person who is only dead in the body. One of the other things that we have to deal with today, of course, that many people die who don't want a Christian funeral. And these funerals that happen in cemeteries can be so depressing and wounding too. I've taken 2 or 3, and I think that what needs to be done is that such a ceremony should be more like a memorial service, that you convey something, the essence of the person to whom one is saying goodbye. And I always invite people to come up and place their flowers on the coffin, or to kiss the coffin, or to touch it, not to be afraid of the coffin. Ritual is a collective or individual attempt to conjure up or reawaken those deeper layers of the psyche which the light of reason and the power of the will can never reach, and bring them back to life. We have to learn how to activate these images, to use our imaginations. Now I come to the last section, the work that we've been doing this week, and the work that I do often from time to time with groups of people, is how to activate people's imaginations, to stimulate their imaginations so that they could also, in their own time, create their own rituals. Now, there are 2 types of rituals. There are personal rituals, which are perhaps once only and may be carried out entirely on one's own. But most rituals involve groups of people. They are collective. But I want to just give you 2 examples of personal rituals. One grew out of an exercise that I use with bamboo poles. These bamboo poles are about 7 foot long. And the exercise is the person has got about 8 or 9 bamboo poles, and they're not allowed to let go of them, so they keep slipping and sliding. It's very awkward to control and manipulate them. And one student wrote about what happened to him doing this exercise, which clearly became a ritual because it became a rite of passage for him. He wrote, Monday the 10th was one of the days that sticks out most for me in the 5-week period of working with James. It was the day I worked with the bamboo poles. I was told to use them as though they were part of me, as though I'd lived with them always, and I was told to travel, to go on a journey with them. At first, no image came to my mind, and so I waited patiently, as James had taught us to do. Then all of a sudden, a picture of my mother flashed into my mind. She has suffered from Parkinson's disease for 20 years, and as a child I had grown up submerged in my mother's illness. Now in this room, with these crutches made of bamboo, I was transformed into a cripple. For the first time I knew exactly what she felt like, trapped and yet not trapped, unable to walk as others did, and yet with the power to move. Like being caught in a slow-moving nightmare which you cannot wake up from because you are already awake. Yet each day it becomes that little bit harder to walk. A little more effort is needed to do certain things until the power to do these specific things goes and recedes into the blackness of cruel memory. I think if I have one fear in life, it is to end my days, as my mother is still doing, locked in a mobility vacuum, a slow motion film that is slowly, almost imperceptibly running down, a life that is no life, a death that is no death. This I fear. And yet it has taken me all this time to come to terms with my own emotions until that day in New Hall when I face them finally. That's an extraordinary rite of passage he made. And the other one I would like to describe is, I can't mention her name, a much loved and well-known actress who took part in a week-long ritual workshop in Wales. And we did an exercise where out of newspaper and sellotape you create a beautiful boat, and then you place in it a nightlight, and you have to sail it to a frontier. And the frontier is one of the central images that I use because the frontier represents so many things. We all have to cross one frontier or another in our life. It might be the frontier of retirement, the frontier of death, which we're afraid of crossing. It might be the frontier of our sexuality. There are many, many frontiers. And it happened in the evening and was dark. And people took about an hour and a half to make these extraordinary, beautiful boats out of newspaper and sellotape and to place their nightlights in. And then they began sailing them to the frontier. And I noticed, I better call her Mary for safety's sake, that Mary had built a round boat with her nightlight in it. And it took a long time. People were totally absorbed in this experience. And they all crossed over the frontier. But then I became aware that Mary was sitting in a corner holding her round boat in her lap, and she didn't cross the frontier. Afterwards, it was clear that people needed to speak. There was a long discussion about what had been happening to each individual, the voyage that they'd made and what the frontier meant for them. And then they all dispersed for the night. And in the gloaming, Mary came towards me holding her round boat, and she said, "Will you blow it out for me? I can't." So I blew it out, not knowing why she'd asked me. And about 2 minutes later, I saw her in the arms of one of my colleagues, who's a therapist, sobbing. And later that evening, my colleague rang me, said, "Can you see Mary in the morning and create, because it was the final morning, a ritual specially for her, because she had learned that day that she could no longer biologically have a child. And so what the round boat represented, and the candle in the midst, was the child in her womb that she would have liked to have had." And we did create a ritual in the morning for her without naming her. And as a result of that experience, that rite of passage through a simple newspaper boat, she, though she's now still very much in demand as an actress, she trained as a counsellor for women who either have miscarriages or stillborn babies or can no longer, like she herself, have a child. And so that was a very, very important journey that she made. One other, yes, to tell story, and for me, in some ways, it's the most powerful ritual that I've seen anybody evolve. And this was when I first began this work about 45 years ago in New York. I had a group of dancers and singers and one composer at the Juilliard School of Music. And one of the dancers, Carolyn, was very distressed because her beloved teacher, professor, had died. And she tried to express this in class, and everything that she did was sentimental, melodramatic, banal, like the worst kind of psychodrama. And then she was attacked by the rest of the group because she believed in God. And she was so disturbed by this tremendous attack that she had a sleepless night. And the next day, when she came to work with me in the studio on her own, suddenly, out of this turmoil that she felt, there erupted the first seeds of a ritual that she created and worked on and finally did in the presence of others. And I will describe it to you because it's a very powerful and moving story. It began with her seated, struggling inside a wooden hoop, like a child's wooden hoop. It was almost as though she was trapped inside it, like being in a tunnel. And she kept reiterating, crying out the words of her grief, "No God, no God, no God, no God," and finally collapsed on the floor with the wooden hoops spinning round her. And then a flute was heard playing, and she opened her eyes and looked at the circle, reached out and touched it, and began to lift it, saying, "My circle is my God. My God is my circle," and standing on tiptoe held it up and sang out the words, "My circle encompasses me." She had found her own inner God, her own inner center. My circle encompasses me. My God is my circle. Conclusion. The aim is to put people in touch with their center and to give them the experience of externalizing what they find there, using the ritual to reach the inner voice or image that is waiting to be expressed. At the court of King Arthur, the knights were seated at a table, and King Arthur would not let the meal be served until an adventure appeared. And indeed, an adventure did occur. The Grail itself appeared, covered by a cloth, carried by angels, and all were amazed. And then it withdrew. And Arthur's nephew Gawain stood up and said, "I propose a vow. I propose that we should all go in pursuit of the Grail, to behold it unveiled." And it was determined that that was what they would do. But then, we read, they thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. Each entered the forest by the path that he had chosen, where there was no path and where it was darkest. Each of us has to set out our own journey with great faith and with great courage, like this prayer written by a young American of 23 in Colorado. I invited a whole group to write a prayer to a known or unknown God, because obviously many of them had no religious practice at all. And here is Dixon's prayer to an unknown God. With the unsecuring sea stretching before me, to mystery I make my pledge, to search, to swim, to dive as deep as I can. With the unsecuring sea stretching before me, to mystery I give my thanks. For you I am thankful. With you I am. Without you I am not. Ritual is indeed a voyage into the unknown. And so I end with the words of Emily Dickinson. Exaltation is the going of an inland soul to sea, past the houses, past the headlands, into deep eternity. That's the voyage that we all have to have the courage to take. Thank you. What?
What kind of ritual would you suggest for a divorce?
I can't give you an answer because a ritual should be such a ritual needs to be created for a specific a group of people, and so in America, some of the women's groups have been creating rituals for divorce, in particular where children are involved, trying to make it a healing process of letting go. And I think it's something that all parties would have to talk about and evolve for themselves. You can't just come along and write down a ritual and say, do that. It wouldn't be organic. I mean, the way I described Sarah and Steve's marriage, that grew out of many meetings and out of their deepest desires. So if you know somebody who's going through a difficult breakup, that's something that they must, and that will be very healing for them if they can agree to create such a ritual. Repetition is important, but if it becomes stale, if it becomes dead, if one's mind is elsewhere while one's doing it, then something is wrong. And either one must change it or one must rediscover it. I've given the example before of the sign of the cross. There's two things about the sign of the cross. and having lived in Ireland, observed it very much. It looks at first like a superstitious gesture. It isn't, of course, because it's putting a shield against yourself, against the evil one, the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. I am now protected against the dark one. But it's done very hurriedly, people hurrying into church. It's almost automatically, unthinkingly done. But in moments of crisis or fear or pain, suddenly it becomes something very real. So the repetitive habit, suddenly it comes alive. But also, one must always be rediscovering the repetitive rituals. And again, I have found, I won't go into it now, that you can make the sign of the cross. If you take time, we rush through things. That is the great problem today. If you take a long time, as I have done, to make the sign of the cross and really think about what is happening and what those words mean, it becomes a very powerful and profound experience. But we gallop through everything. That's the great danger in our society. No, the repetition, like my mother's constantly putting the little egg cup, that is very, very important. So I'm not saying there shouldn't be repetition, but very often, for instance, oh yes, well, I give an example. I once had to celebrate the Eucharist in Chichester Cathedral, and I had been the previous Sunday, 9 o'clock Eucharist. It's where all the elderly gentlemen in tweeds go and ladies in pearls, because it's the Book of Common Prayer. And so it's the only chance that they get it, and that's wonderful because it's wonderful language. But I noticed that they gabble the Lord's Prayer. I mean, it happens all over the place. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, blah, 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 blah. So when I got up in the middle of the sermon, I said, I would like you all to say the Lord's Prayer very slowly, thoughtfully, in your own rhythm and in your own time. And it was suddenly very moving to hear all these elderly people saying the Lord's Prayer thoughtfully, carefully, and, you know, it was all broken up. It took longer than usual, but it was meaningful suddenly instead of an unthinking repetition. That's what one has to guard against. I must tell you a lovely grace. You probably heard of somebody called Ned Sherrin on the radio and things, and he's also directs in the theatre. And my friend Stephanie Cole was in a new play in London called A Passionate Woman. It was the first night party. And we were all at this great gathering. And the play was about a wedding. And so suddenly the company of actors entered with their director, Ned Sherrin, who was wearing a dog collar. And the barker said, "Pray be upstanding while the the Reverend Canon Ned Sherrin leads us all in grace." And the grace that Ned Sherrin was, "O Lord, who didst turn the water into wine, grant us now to reverse thy miracle." So, Anna Halprin, whom I haven't mentioned, who's a great pioneer in ritual in America, a friend of mine, she also talks about the importance of creating very simple rituals for children going to a new school, because it's every time a child goes to a new home or a new school, it's quite threatening. There's a wonderful example. I'm sorry, a slight divergence of a child. I once asked somebody was having to leave the home in which he'd lived, grown up with his parents, and would I do a simple? He was finding it very painful, so we went through all the empty rooms one by one, and a woman present told me of her small son when they moved home. He ran round kissing all the walls of the home before they left it. That was his way of saying goodbye to the house. Children have an extraordinary spontaneity. I can't answer your question because I don't know the situation of the people. So I have no light to throw on it. But it needs gentleness and tenderness, of course, absolutely. So maybe you've got to be the one. I suspect you are, actually, yes. One last question. There'll be coffee, I believe, outside, cakes. Yes, so that's when questions often happen. Yes, hello.
Hello. A lot of people feel the Church of England concentrates so much on human beings, on human soul. And of course this is an ecological college. And we happen to have a church near here at Cornwood, which is using now a lot of Celtic services. And also some of the services in the open air with bonfires and things. I mean, this is amazing. The Church of England. Bonfires.
Oh, bonfires. That would be very exciting.
We had a bat in here one day.
Yes.
But I mean, and I have been to a service there where everyone at the end of it went out and planted trees, and so it's interesting really that a few people in the Church of England at any rate are beginning to think about ourselves in the whole world instead of just about
Yes.
that we are members of the universe, not just members of the human race.
Yes.
And I wonder how far you've gone in this direction of including the natural world in your ritual.
I think it's wonderful. I wish that people would have. There's a wonderful barn near us in Wales, and I wish they'd have the Christmas service in the barn with all the animals around. I wish that more services were held in the open air. When it happens, it's wonderful.
Yes, you said about the sun rising one.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, St. Francis of Assisi was much given to us how the first Christmas crib came about, because he insisted on having the midnight mass in a cave up on the mountains among real cows and sheep and fleas as well. It's a very salutary reminder of, instead of being in a rather kind of bourgeois safe setting. No, that's quite right. And of course St. Francis was a great ecologist. His great Canticle of Praise is a hymn to ecology.
Rather sun.
One last question, then that's it. Yes. I would have thought the answer is, and it's done a lot in America, is just actually taking children into the country. I've seen photographs of children lying in the woods and seeing the dappling of light coming down through the leaves and reflected on their skin, and actually smelling the soil and climbing trees, and also visiting lots of working farms that children visit and learn how the land should be farmed. I think it's teaching that's needed more than a ritual there. I would have thought it's a question of education. That's my immediate response anyway. Right, coffee calls.
Thank you very much indeed, James. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Anne.
Lots of thought.
Thank you.
And wonderfully prepared and presented. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Please join us.